All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here today. We're going to go through and see everybody on screen. Thanks for attending this speech this evening. All right. This evening, we're going to discuss misinformation and how it's everywhere. It's on our news feeds or social media, everywhere we look. It's somewhere it's calling fake news. And actually, everybody's heard of the Salem witch trials, where back in the 1600s, neighbors looked at each other instead of shouting fake news, they shouted witch. And then they put each other on trial. And according to the History Channel, ultimately 18 people were convicted of witchcraft with a sentence of death. And while that might not seem super relatable to today in the modern world, we would never do that, right? One of the best well-known works about the Salem witch trials is Arthur Miller's The Crucible. And Arthur Miller actually wrote an essay about why he wrote The Crucible, which was it was an allegory for what he was going through in the 1950s with Senator Joseph McCarthy and his witch hunt for communists, which resulted in people like Arthur Miller and several other people getting blackballed from Hollywood. So even though the Salem witch trials were in the 1600s, Arthur Miller saw parallels with what he was going through in the 1950s, and here we are 70 years later, and there are still some ways that misinformation is prevalent and has lasting consequences. And while misinformation could lead to trials, it can also be things that just happen in your own inner circle. So one example that a lot of people have an experience with is you go to a restaurant, or maybe your friend went to a restaurant. They had a great time while they were there, and then they leave the restaurant and they're like, "Oh, I feel sick." And then all night they just feel super sick. So the next day they're like, "I got food poisoning from this local restaurant. And it was terrible and awful." You tell all your friends, you tell your family, you post it on social media, you go onto the restaurant's website and place reviews saying that they gave you food poisoning. And then maybe this even escalates so much that the restaurant has to close down. And then you might have been a part of misinformation because you can't prove that the restaurant actually gave you food poisoning. Maybe you had a stomach bug. Maybe you actually are allergic to something and didn't know about it. And that's what made you get sick. You just don't know. So a way to combat this sort of misinformation, just a passing comment that this place gave me food poisoning, is actually, if you go to the Chicago Department of Public Health, they claim that they investigate every situation of somebody who claims food poisoning. They go to the restaurant, they get records of who attended, who ate what, and they do lots of interviews with people to see who actually might have gotten sick and what the restaurant did and if it was their fault. Doing this process prevents you from spreading misinformation around, affecting the restaurant's business, and helps gives the restaurant opportunity to defend themselves, along with if they were making you sick, they did give you food poisoning. It helps prevent other people from getting sick because the Chicago Department of Public Health go in, investigate, and let the restaurant know what they need to do, or if it's really bad, actually close them down. So misinformation can be something that's small and in your own inner circle, but it can also be something on a much wider scale. So these days, podcasts are all the rage. Everybody has a podcast, it feels like athletes, actors, singers, history people, and they all like to tell these interesting stories. And sometimes these stories might not be might more serve a certain narrative. One such example is Joe Rogan recently had Donald Trump on for an extended interview. This interview, according to YouTube, within 3 days, reached 38 million views. And during this interview, Joe Rogan actually discussed vaccine-derived polio, saying it was on the rise. And Joe Rogan talked about polio, vaccine-derived polio, as if to say, hey, we should really look into vaccines. They're causing some issues out here. Polio is coming back. Polio is something that's supposed to be eradicated 20 years ago. And oops, sorry. And now it's on the way back. What do we do? So I was listening to that and went, that's interesting. Let's go to the expert, shall we? The Center for Disease Control. And what do they have to say about vaccine-derived polio? The CDC says vaccine-derived polio is only a problem when vaccines are not widespread in a community and poor hygiene is also rampant. So The only reason vaccine-derived polio becomes a thing is if people are not taking vaccines at wide. So if one person in the community gets the vaccine and 9 people do not, and there's poor hygiene, then vaccine-derived polio can be a problem. But it is not from the vaccine itself, which is what Joe Rogan implied to his 30 million viewers in those first 3 days and anybody who has listened since. So with all this misinformation around, whether it be us in our own circles or even on a national scale with the media and podcasts and such, or TikTok videos, how do we combat misinformation? So one thing to do is pull out our lovely phones and go to Google. Anytime you hear something where you're like, let's look into that a little bit more, such as vaccine-derived polio is on the rise, or this restaurant gives people food poisoning, you can go to Google and check sources. And now, how do you evaluate if a source is legitimate? Well, Georgetown Library has some advice. First and foremost, you can see if it's a government website. Government websites typically have to go through several stages of approval before publishing information. They also most likely have to list their research and the reasoning that they can say the things that they do, such as why vaccine-derived polio is only in communities where poor hygiene is rampant, what research has gone into that. You can also see if the information comes from an accredited news source, such as an outlet like the Associated Press, as opposed to xxdownwithvaccines.com or your Uncle Bill on Facebook. And you can validate, did they do the research? Is it able to replicate? Or is this just a screenshot that's been posted 50 times over and there's no original source on this information? So just by taking a few moments to determine, is the source reliable? Is the information replicable? Is there prevalent bias? You can see if misinformation is becoming a problem in this situation. So overall, misinformation is nothing new. It's been a problem since at least the Salem witch trials, but really probably since humans have been around. But there are ways to be aware of it, combat it, and just be a more informed human so that the next time someone shouts, witch, you can take a moment, be rational, and not say, let's put them to death, but be like, hey, there are some witches that are friendly. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here this evening. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.